Okay, I am really excited to get started with Black Lives Matter and investigating sort of protests and what's going on in contemporary society for protesting. Very important issue right now, and frankly, for a long time. Um, this book that we are reading from is a very recently published book in 2017, even though a lot of things have happened since he wrote it. Really, 2016, because that's when he wrote the book and sort of ended creating contemporary edits to it. But Christopher J. LeBron really investigates the start of the Black Lives Matter movement and how we sort of go from here. And he uses that to think about some past historical figures to then investigate sort of current moments and movements as well. But before we talk about LeBron's work, I want to talk about bell hooks. And this is an article that I did not have you read, but I wanted to talk about it. Although it's complicated, I want you to have some idea of sort of a feminist voice as well, because she's very much in line with LeBron's thoughts in that she finds that Black women very much don't have a place in some of the larger conversations about postmodernism and contemporary life. So I wanted to kind of talk about that so that we can talk about some of these ideas and theories and then really invest our time in some of the art next week. So bell hooks is well known for being named Gloria Jean Watkins, but she takes on the name of Bell Hooks, which is a pen name from her maternal great-grandmother, Belle Blair Hooks. And she took it because her great-grandmother had a sappy and bold tongue, which Hooks admired. She also puts her name in lowercase to distinguish her from her grandmother and to show the content of her books is more important than the author. She's a very famous author right now, has written innumerable books, and when we started this class, we didn't really go over sort of contemporary art as a whole, but when we sort of study modern art, we call the art after that postmodernism. So all the performance art that we've been focusing on is all within postmodernism, which is after it's brought in by the post-industrial society, advanced capitalism based on information. Around the 1970s, impulses surrounding modern art had exhausted themselves, feeling potentially that all rules had been broken. Everything is a norm breaker. The media coverage encouraged this by treating each new consumer product as a revolution and rule breaking as the norm. Like I said, we have focused on these ideas through performance theory and performance art, and you've probably seen this as well in your modern art classes, where you have in 212 probably, where you have modern art changing over into postmodernism, where contemporary artists are trying to engage with new ideas outside of modernism and high art making, like painting and sculpture. So when you get into contemporary art, people are inspired by their own internal and external experience. Contemporary art has no single point of view or objective, and a lot of it is based in globalization today, right? Because of the internet, the great diversity of perspectives, pluralist and globalized society, where innovation can happen anywhere, etc. And what you find happening is pluralism. So many ideas and styles coexisting at the same time, which is very different from what we've been seeing in modernism. We also see the bringing back of old styles and mediums, and within this, postmodernists questioning one of the modernist basic notions of whether or not an individual can create something original. Themes involve identity, body, technology, globalization, migration, etc. So maybe some of these things are familiar to you or not. But this begins our conversation about sort of identity and constructs of identity as well. And the reason I bring all of these up is because bell hooks is contemplating the idea of identity and otherness in this article. So there are a lot of ways in which identity changes and is manipulated, not in necessarily a bad way, but we have sort of feminist movements, the rising international presence, civil rights causes, spread of information through the internet, globalization, all of these things that really change the way people look at themselves and identify themselves. And bell hooks is going to talk about the importance of identity in postmodern theory and how it applies to sort of Black Lives Matter, even though she doesn't talk about Black Lives Matter in this article. So a lot of her ideas come from this idea of the otherness. And she keeps talking about how postmodern theory is interested in contemplating difference and otherness. And that's sort of the basis for a lot of their work. Now, what is this? Otherness is sort of the creation of binaries. There's a lot of ways that you can think about otherness, but in this context, she's talking about otherness within race, as well as gender. So male versus female, black and white, heterosexual versus homosexual, Western versus non-Western. We see that as well in LeBron's work when he talks about Audre Lorde, as well as Anna Julia Cooper. You also have this idea of alterity, the philosophical and anthropological term meaning otherness, and is the other of two, often used by media and text to express something other than sameness, outside tradition or convention, creation of otherness through negative comparison. Obviously, identity is more complex than just sort of binaries like male, female, insider, outsider, etc. And we're going to see this through the analysis of bell hooks and LeBron as well. But when you start thinking about this sort of modernist need to create otherness, you can think about the constructs of primitivism that may or may not be familiar to you in modern art, but you have a lot of artists using sort of quote-unquote primitive or authentic cultures, like African cultures, and using them as sort of aesthetic principles in their art. And this is sort of a dumbing down a little bit of some of the issues going on in modern art to sort of fit it in to make a point here. But this is also part of a larger issue that bell hooks is addressing, where you have an exhibition like this put on by MoMA in the 1980s, where they are comparing modernist works, like Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Picasso, to the African objects that would have been sort of the inspiration for his work, as they're wearing African masks. And so when they do this and they go and put these modernist objects next to primitive objects or authentic objects, quote unquote, it very much takes away of the value of that object, right? Here you have these objects, these cultural objects that are in here with the modern objects. And while the modernist objects are described as, oh, Picasso's work, he did this then, in what period, the other objects that are from African or Oceanic cultures are not being described in any way other than aesthetically. So they're not talking about what culture they're from, they're not talking about their purpose. And so in comparing them to these other objects, they make them the lesser, right? They're just the aesthetic sort of side note to modernist works. And in very similar ways, modernists were using these objects in that way. They weren't necessarily spending time, this is Picasso's work here, with these objects in any sort of critical way. They believe that these sort of native cultures or African cultures or third world cultures or whatever multiplicity of terms that they're using at the time, they're using it as sort of this authentic self that all of these artists are trying to get to in the creation of modern art. And like I said, it's very complicated. And the directors are criticized for this exhibition, creating this sort of us versus them scenario. And all of them are saying, no, we didn't mean to do that, even though it's very sort of inherently racist perspective of history and the creation of art, right? That the only purpose of these objects is to be inspiration for modern masters. This is Giacometti's work. And you can see this also with masks. They do a ton of mask comparisons in this exhibition as well. And it all leads back to artists like Gauguin and other modern artists who are fantasizing people who were other than themselves. Gauguin marrying very young Tahitian girls and believing in this sort of fantasy of an island that doesn't even exist anymore. So when Gauguin is painting Tahiti, he's painting these images of these erotic women and this pre-colonial society that doesn't exist anymore, right? To create this sort of hype about his work, as well as these countries he's living in, which do not in fact exist anymore, right? But he's trying to promote them as this sort of sexuality, and to also make him more famous, and to promote his work as well. So bell hooks talks about how these discussions of otherness, of difference, that postmodernists are questioning, right? They're questioning why Picasso, Gauguin, all of these artists made this work originally. Why did they do this? And she's saying that postmodernists claim to be critiquing those issues, to be rethinking them, to be saying that's not how we're going to create art anymore. However, she states postmodernist discourses are often exclusionary, even when, having been accused of lacking concrete relevance, they call attention to and appropriate the experience of difference and otherness in order to provide themselves with oppositional political meaning, legitimacy, and immediacy. And so, while they're trying to create these ideas, they're actually using them in almost the same way that modernists are, which is to validate their own works and discussions, and to say, oh, well, of course we're engaging with globalized perspectives, right? Employing a critique of essentialism allows African Americans to acknowledge the way in which class mobility has altered collective Black experience, so that racism does not necessarily have the same impact on our lives. Such a critique allows us to infer multiple Black identities, varied Black experience. It also challenges colonialist and puritan paradigms of Black identity, which represent Blackness one-dimensionally in ways that reinforce and sustain white supremacy. So she still sees very much that Black scholars and Black artists have to engage in rethinking their identity and who they are within postmodern discourses, to try to move away from this one-dimensionality of how people view their lived experience, right? Is there such thing as a authentic or natural Black voice, right? Would you say that about someone of a different race? And it's always about trying to pigeonhole them. And she talks about this nationalism versus essentialism, which is that essentialism on the one hand, in the way that she's talking about it, is that certain categories like gender, race, etc., have an underlying reality or true nature that one cannot observe directly. Therefore, certain phenomena are natural, inevitable, and biologically determined. Versus nationalism. Beyond social movement, nationalism can be considered as an ideological movement directed at the autonomy, unity, and identity of a population, considered as a real or potential nation. And so, versus patriotism. When there are groups sort of coming together and trying to figure out their identity in sort of politics, we have at times Black figures moving towards essentialism or nationalism, when bell hooks doesn't necessarily see either of these as really powerful to promote change separately or together. Saying that even that the Black Power movement goes too far into essentialism as well, which I will bring back up shortly. So, when you look at these, she wants to make sure that postmodernist scholars and critics are actually thinking about otherness and difference and what that means. Confronting both the lack of recognition of Black female presence that much postmodernist theory reinscribes and reinstate on the part of most Black folks, to hearing about real connections between postmodernism and Black experience, I enter a discourse, a practice, where there may be no ready audience for my words, no clear listener, uncertain then that my voice can or will be heard. This radical postmodernist practice, most powerfully conceptualized as a politics of difference, should incorporate the voices of displaced, marginalized, exploited, and oppressed Black people. Which is obvious, right? You would think that postmodernists, if they are interested in viewing the other, they have to be looking at the displaced, the marginalized, the exploited, who they have been exploiting for years, right? And she sees that sort of scholars are still sort of investing in themselves in this very one-dimensional idea of what that means. While scholars on the surface support otherness and difference, third world scholars, especially elites and white critics who passively absorb white supremacist thinking and therefore never notice or look at Black people on the street, at their jobs, who render us invisible with their gaze in all areas of daily life, are not likely to produce liberatory theory that will challenge racist domination or to promote breakdown in traditional ways of seeing and thinking about reality, ways of constructing aesthetic theory and practice. So when you think about the white critics of the world, like in modernism, you have Clement Greenberg, you have all of these white male voices that continue to dominate in this sort of coded familiarity with one another. And this is a problem. This is a problem that this is the way that scholars and critics and artists are talking to one another. She brings up sort of even the fact that when you start to discuss popular topics like rap or hip-hop music in the context of theory and criticism, etc., you focus specifically on Black men, right? Criss Cross, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Biggie Smalls, Tupac, NWA, Run DMC. She's in the 1990s, don't forget. And ignore Black female voices, right? Are there Black female voices that are being used, expressed as part of these larger narratives, right? Or do we continue to just look at Black male rappers? While these groups are trying to break down master narratives and longing for a critical voice, as well as testimony to the underclass, where are the female voices? Why are they missing? She says. And has this changed today with figures like Cardi B or Nicki Minaj or Lizzo? Are Black women being more incorporated into fields where they've been often relegated to the outside? Confronting both the lack of recognition of Black female presence, that much postmodernist theory reascribes, and resistance on the part of most Black folks to hearing about real connections between postmodernism and Black experience, I enter a discourse, a practice, where there may be no ready audience for my words, no clear listener, uncertain then that my voice can or will be heard. Do Black women want to be a part of a discourse that does not include them and doesn't seem to consider them a part of it? And Bell Hooks even sees this in publishing as well, that when she was trying to submit creative writing to publishing houses, she was told her work does not conform to the type of writing they think Black women should be doing or the type of writing they believe will sell. Well, they're not the ones with the Black voices or the ones reading Black work, right? So again, they're telling them what is valuable, what is important about their voices. And as you can imagine, this causes hopelessness. There's an increasing class division and differentiation, creating on the one hand a significant Black middle class, high anxiety ridden, insecure, willing to be co-opted and incorporated into the powers that be, concerned with racism to the degree that it poses constraints on upward social mobility, and on the other, a vast growing Black underclass, an underclass that embodies a kind of walking nihilism of pervasive drug addiction, pervasive alcoholism, pervasive homicide, and an exponential rise in suicide. Now, because of the industrialization, we also have a devastated Black industrial working class. We are talking about tremendous hopelessness. And of course, this is also because of this identity being partialed out into this one-dimensionality, right? This multifaceted idea is important. Radical postmodernism calls attention to those sensibilities which are shared across boundaries of class, gender, and race, which could be fertile ground for construction of empathy. Ties that would promote recognition of common commitments and serve as a base for solidarity and coalition. Postmodernism critiques of essentialism, which challenge notions of universality and static overdetermined identity within mass culture and mass consciousness, can open up new possibilities for the construction of the self and the assertion of agency. And Bell Hooks feels that she can do that with her work. She feels connected to the Black lived experience and that she still has connections to underclass poor Black community and other figures who are outside of white institutions as a whole, so that she can talk about these things and engage in sort of conversations. She also talks about the Black Power movement, which she saw as the sort of closest agenda to defining essentialist and nationalist constructs of Black identity, even though it was too essentialist. So although it was moving to found Black-owned bookstores and food cooperatives and farms and medias and schools and clinics, it took it maybe too far outside of the realm of not supporting enough nationalism necessarily. So you have sort of figures in the civil rights movement, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but you also have female figures as well, like Angela Davis and Kathleen Cleaver. And it becomes ironic then, she states, that after the Black Power movement happens, people ask whatever happened to Black America, even though this is in the wake of the Black Power movement when all of these figures were killed off, right? We have Martin Luther King being assassinated. We have Malcolm X being killed. And so while these marginalized Black subjects had a large voice, she says marginalized Black subjects who had at least for a moment successfully demanded a hearing, who had made it possible for Black liberation to be a national political agenda. Many people were lost and sort of stopped the spread of the liberation struggle at that time. So then what does she see for the future of protesting? While people continue to sort of try to stop radical Black subjectivity, it doesn't give them a voice. Many of us are struggling to find new strategies of resistance. We must engage decolonization as a critical practice if we are to have meaningful chances of survival, even as we must simultaneously cope with the loss of political grounding, which made radical activism more possible. To take racism seriously, one must consider the plight of underclass people of color, a vast majority of whom are Black. And she does comment on Black Lives Matter, and I will sort of talk about that at the end of this presentation because it's interesting and we'll have to see how you guys feel about it. So when we have the writing of The Making of Black Lives by Christopher J. LeBron in 2016/2017, he states really at the beginning, I hope beyond all hope that in a year or so it took me to write it, the fatal conditions in America that moved me to write the book in the first place would allow me to qualify with a ray of optimism the somber reflections that follow. And like he states, 1 week prior to sitting down to write the introduction, there is the killing of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile by Baton Rouge and Minneapolis police. Sterling being shot at close range, with cops literally standing over him and pointing a gun directly into his heart. And Philando Castile, whose girlfriend live streamed a video of him after he was shot, that went live on Facebook after cops shot him in his car. And you can see all of these videos online if you like. I'm just not going to post them in my PowerPoint necessarily. And this becomes a big moment for Black Lives Matter again and again. You keep having this constantly happening. And people come to speak out. You have Henry Taylor producing The Times That Ain't A-Changin' Fast Enough from 2017, from the Whitney Biennial, where you have Philando Castile being shot in his car next to his girlfriend as she screams, even though he informs them that he has a gun, it's in his glove box, and he posed no threat to them. And this protesting that looks very similar to what we're dealing with today. which happened 4 years ago, right? We have people going out and protesting and cops coming in full armored gear to attack a girl in a flowing dress, literally holding no weapons, peacefully protesting in this case. As LeBron states, with the title of this chapter and introduction, Naming the Dead in the Name of the Living, he adds these names to this list that already exists of people, hundreds of names that have just been started since 2012, of Black men and women who continually are killed by police without real reason. And he names the most important figure with the development of Black Lives Matter, which is Trayvon Martin from February 26th of 2012, who was a 17-year-old boy and shot by George Zimmerman, who was a neighborhood watch volunteer. And Zimmerman confronted him against 911 advice, and ended with Trayvon Martin shot dead, with Zimmerman getting off with the murder, claiming self-defense. Despite Martin's younger age, weight, size, disadvantage, and the all-important fact he was unarmed, his character quickly became the center of speculation and conversation. He was a Black teenager, wearing a hoodie, walking through someone else's neighborhood. His only possible crime seemed to be walking while Black, says LeBron. It's also important to look at the images that media portrays, right? This is one of the big images of Trayvon Martin, because he had his hood up, trying to make him look a particular way, that people will think of him a particular way, right? They want to make sure that people think of him as the assailant, right? As the villain, as the negative person in this scenario, although you have an adult male shooting a child with no weapon. And there's even a documentary that exists now, I believe it's called Rest in Power, about Trayvon Martin, where you literally see George Zimmerman, who got off with the killing of Trayvon Martin, who goes to things like gun shows and gun rallies and signs Skittle packages for people, right? The only thing that was found on Trayvon Martin. He literally goes to meet his supporters to sign autographs for them. Can you imagine how ridiculous that sounds? As George Zimmerman was not held accountable for what he did, Black Lives Matter was founded by the sisters Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Thus, it was the death and failure of our justice system to account for the unnecessary death of a Black American that promoted three women to offer these three basic and urgent words to the American people: Black Lives Matter. So the movement today, it has become sort of a demanding force in America, asking for change. And it's not necessarily associated with any particular group. I find that people sort of often try to pigeonhole this group as a whole, and we'll talk about that. But Black Lives Matter represents an idea that motivates, mobilizes, and informs actions and programs of many local branches of the movement. It can be picked up and deployed by any interested group of activists inclined to speak out and act against racial injustice. There's something powerful about this word and this set of words. According to LeBron, that alone makes those three words a touchstone for our American lives today. The struggle to insist that Black lives are indeed lives and therefore not candidates for cursory or careless or hateful or negligible elimination. And there's sort of no philosophical backing yet for their group as a whole, like Black Power movements. So he hopes that his text can be sort of a beginning to understanding this movement as a whole. And really sort of basing it in the fact that Black Americans are humans too, which is a ridiculous thing to think that we have to fight for, right? In writing this book, Black Lives Matter are three words often used as a lament, as a signal that our democracy has been, is, and seems likely to continue failing 12% of its population, which is now 13%. again, this is not about these three figures as leaders. It is about this movement as a whole and what people stand for. Although looking at the website is beneficial, we'll talk about how that leads to problems as well. But the idea as a whole is not rooted in one person necessarily. And we've seen that this movement has grown, right, with similarities of Eric Gardner's death to George Floyd's, as well as Breonna Taylor. And the gorgeous cover that Amy Sherrill made for her on Vanity Fair. Amy Sherrill being the woman who painted Michelle Obama's portrait. And so many others, right? Even this, in the last sort of calendar year, Ahmaud Arbery, Tatiana Jefferson, and many, many other figures. This is an interactive website that has a bunch of information about some lives as well. All of these things come down to some constructs of white supremacy, as LeBron talks about. Thus, equality must be secured by blacks, distrusting whites and taking their security into their own hands by any force necessary. And this problem of sort of racial ignorance. And a lot of people felt that they saw that as well this week with Trump versus Biden in their debate. That if someone is not willing to denounce white supremacy, are they then part of white supremacy? And like I said before, a lot of these things come down to diversion, to deflection. I don't know if any of you feel like you spend hours on Facebook being mad at people for no reason. Not no reason. You fall into this trap on Facebook of trying to respond and talk to people about these issues when really all we ever get to is deflection, ignoring facts, and continuing to ignore that racism is a systemic problem, right? Which is. This is not sort of a conversation because I don't need to play with facts about systemic racism here. But when we start talking about, the Black Lives Matter founders are trained Marxists, that they said this in a talk, right? Again, deflection. This is not about who these women are as figures, even though they are powerful and have given a powerful voice to the Black people. It is not about them as individuals. And they don't also lead this group, right? I was also trying to see how people think Black Lives Matter is actually Marxist, because this seems to be an argument. So I watched a video which literally said the problem was that Black Lives Matter was trying to destroy families, which is something that they said in sort of their original, one of their original pages, which is silly. And to the most part, when you think about the idea of the nuclear family, the problem sort of inherently with this social construct is that it's based in a man, woman, and children, right? And people are not willing to ascribe to that anymore because there are many more ideas of what a family is today. And I feel like when I think about the nuclear family and Black lives, what ends up happening is they militarize ideas about Black families and Black people to talk about how they don't have these family structures that are necessary for them to be performing figures of society, which is nonsense. When you start sort of you have to sort of break down these social constructs that are rooted in racism, in sexism, for goodness sakes, against sort of people who are homosexual, who want to have different lives than everyone else. You have to break down these things to some effect, right? It's not about breaking your families apart, right? It's about the problem with those ideas, right? regardless. See, here's me getting off on a tangent because this is what happens when you spend all this time trying to argue about these deflections that are not about this movement as a whole, right? The same thing as talking about violence, right? And even when this Times article came out and they say Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful, new report finds, in the Time article, it's not about whether they're violent or not violent. There's been so much violence on both sides. If you don't think that people who were peaceful protesting were not violated by white supremacists in the past, then you have no understanding of what violence is in this scenario. I believe this is Christopher LeBron, though it could be Bell Hooks. No, it's definitely LeBron. Radicalism is the imagination and will to think and act outside of the bonds of the normally acceptable. Yes, this can be achieved by wielding an AK-47 assault rifle in public as protection from the oppressive police force. It can also be achieved when Audre Lorde insists the erotic lesbian love is politically essential to her as a means of exercising her freedom and flexing her capacity for critical social judgment. I don't really think that at this juncture it is anyone's sort of right, nor will it give anyone sort of power to tell people what they can and cannot do, and how they can or cannot grieve. And so, again, this is another argument that I'm not interested in making when it deflects from sort of larger issues as a whole. I digress. The other chapter that we focused on by LeBron focused on women and Black women. So similarly to looking at other Black women and scholars like Bell Hooks as well. There's the struggle that Black women have faced across centuries against rape, oppression from white men and women and Black men, as well as at the hands of the state, has received inadequate attention. And as we've sort of seen in this class, we've looked at the couple in the cage. There's so many ways you can think about the historic oppression of Black women. The couple in the cage is a good example because of Sarah or Sarche Bartman, who was a woman or several women who were taken around Europe, proclaimed as the Hottentot Venus, as this sort of ethnographic person or object, to show her big butt and her big breasts, and she became this sort of mockery of people, right, to sort of stare and to look at sort of how quote-unquote African women looked. And so there have been so many past oppressive issues that have seemingly not gone away, as LeBron talks about in his work, and sort of looks at some different figures that see that as well. And you can go and look at sort of any movement. I just talked to some of my students about Black suffrage and Black women's role in the first wave of feminism. Figures like Ida B. Wells, who he mentions, and other women were relegated to the backs of women groups and women talks, as sort of white women feminists didn't want to quote-unquote alienate their Southern members of their groups, because this is right after racism in the late 1800s. And so you not only have the separation of Black and white women in the suffragette movement, but you have white women when the vote is granted to Black men in, I think, 1870, in the 15th Amendment. You have that white women and Black women are separated because Black women wanted suffrage for Black men, and white women did not. And that very much went back to sort of racism and some of those issues. And so you have big figures like Ida B. Wells, who is absolutely insanely phenomenal, and she is out there addressing people, fighting with white mobs, in that she's reporting about lynchings and how all Black men are being lynched wrongly. And she publishes all these very famous books and articles to the point that she's literally drawn out or forced out of Memphis where she's living because of sort of her radical notions that the people in the white city don't support. And so you have all of these really big voices that are relegated to the back, not only in sort of history, right? We talk about Susan B. Anthony, we talk about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but where is Ida B. Wells? Where is Sojourner Truth? Where is Anna Julia Cooper, right? That we're talking about in this as well, right? These big figures in the Black suffragette movement that we don't hear about. And Ida B. Wells didn't stand for that, right? In 1913 Parade of Washington, D.C., which was a famous moment for the National Women's Party, they asked Black women to stand at the back, and they refuse. Ida B. Wells comes to sort of stands to the side and then joins up with her fellow Chicago Women's Party group because she's not interested in being separated, right? This is the problem with what women are fighting for, right? The oppression of different groups of people, like women, and she wanted to show her power and voice for Black women. So LeBron talks about these two figures of Anna Julia Cooper and Audre Lorde, and also addresses sort of two deaths of Black women with sort of mental health issues and how that has not been addressed largely. Oh, this is another cartoon from the first wave of feminism. So the first one that he talks about is the death of Eleanor Bumpurs on October 29th of 1984. She owed back payments on rent and was in psychiatric care or needed psychiatric care. She had sort of a psychiatric evaluation. On October 29th, the police came to her door and she was naked and wielding a large kitchen knife. The police forced their entrance. Bumpers struggled, and despite the fact that she was a 66-year-old woman, outnumbered 6-1, an officer first blew off the fingers on one of her hands and then unloaded his shotgun into her chest, fatally lodging 9 pellets. And as LeBron talks about in almost all of these cases that we talk about in contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, that again using fatal force without needing to, in someone like Eleanor Bumpurs as well, right? An elderly woman who is having mental health issues. And LeBron asks us, why was Bumpurs, an elderly Black woman, especially vulnerable? She had no criminal record. She was not violent. It's about this sort of race and gender relationship in that she's a Black woman and is not being sort of treated appropriately for her mental health illness, and having these sort of white men come to this scenario where they don't know how to interact with her. And you have the media treating her like she is a quote-unquote monster. They say that she was a 66-year-old massive and obese woman weighing approximately 275 pounds, and that they were afraid for their lives, and they did not know what else to do, right? That she slashed another officer with a butcher knife. She was violent and uncontrollable, and he feared for the safety of other officers. And when you have a 6-1 scenario with a 66, 67-year-old woman, why are you afraid of her, right? And it comes down to the way that mental health is being treated for Black women, and how Black women are sort of generally treated by the media, by the government, and by sort of society in general. And this was something that was done with Eric Garner as well, right? Where you have people saying, Eric Garner was heavy, he was ill, this is not about the fact that he was choked, almost identically to George Floyd. It was because he was in bad health, and being forced to the ground would have killed him. Even a bear hug would have killed him. What kind of nonsense is that? How do you write off murder by saying, well, he was going to die anyway? What? That's ridiculous. As LeBron states, Bumper's death as a black woman in need of care rather than brutality predates a different and more recent case that also ended in unnecessary death. And also remember, again, when I'm talking about faces and images, this is the image that we're using of Eleanor Bumpurs, right? This is the only one that I found of just her, right? Looking sad, looking depressed. Is this woman that she was? And then this moves to the death of Sandra Bland in Texas in July 10th of 2015. She fails to signal a lane change while driving her car. But she states that she was doing this because the police officer, Brian Encenia, was driving too close to her. There's a strange pause between statements. Encenia asks her to put out her cigarette, even though she is sitting in her own car, and she refuses. He then demands that she gets out of the car, and she also refuses, saying that he must provide rationale. He then attempts to physically remove Bland from her car. After she successfully resists, he pulls back, draws his gun, and points it at her, and she starts screaming profanities. To the point that he eventually cuffs her as she screams in pain. She says he's epileptic, and he says good. 3 days later, on July 13th, Bland was found hanging by a plastic bag from the ceiling of her holding cell. While LeBron states that although she did not die physically by their hands, but by their neglect, person with epilepsy tend to be at higher risk of depression, and was triggered potentially by the interaction with this cop. 6 months earlier, she had just started becoming paranoid, and posting about people and their fear, Black female and male fear of white police officers and being confronted by them. There has even been innumerable stories that she was dead in her mugshot, which is horrific to sort of see this conspiracy theory as well, but that she was killed at their hands, and that they've tried to cover it up, including releasing sort of cropped dash cam footage. So as you see this happening, right, this continuously happening, and this is not new, there have been so many quote-unquote mentally ill women who have been killed at the hands of the police force because of not knowing how to handle sort of a sensitive situation. And so what LeBron does is to analyze the way that people talk about Black women's lives and their ideas and who they are as individuals, to try to sort of negotiate why these things happen. How is it that the police force are in charge of these issues, and then how are they to deal with sort of women and Black women in these situations? So he talks about two different famous Black female figures, Anna Julia Cooper, who is part of that first wave of feminism and Black suffrage movement, as well as Audre Lorde, who's much more recent. And she's very famous for earning a degree as the fourth Black woman to receive a doctoral degree in 1924. And many people call her the mother of Black feminism because of her book, A Voice from the South, by a Black woman of the South. And in this work, she talks about Black women on the sidelines of white men and women, as well as Black men, and pushed to the back. And sort of this being a large problem with sexism and racism, and this movement for Black suffrage. LeBron specifically cites a speech that she gave on womanhood, a vital element in the regeneration and progress of a race, that the future of their race depended on the respect for Black women, and that they needed to start with Black women, and that will lead to the improvement of the race as a whole. Cooper says that women are bound by a system of codes and codes and countersigns, which, though unwritten, forms a network of perfect subordination and unquestioning obedience, often sort of starting in the family, with Black women giving birth and raising Black children and doing most of the child rearing. Black women's double oppression has provided them more lessons in the uses and abuses of power than it has anyone else, Black men or white women. Here's another quote from her during the suffrage movement, which becomes very famous. You also have her talking about Black minds mattered for Black lives and for American democracy. She works to get her school accredited because Black students often had to take secondary tests to apply to quote unquote white schools, and she wanted to make sure that this was not the case, and so she did this. In 1895, she stated, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand of all things essential to human progress." Cooper argued that the structure of women's oppression could be and should be used as a blueprint for a much more rigorous quest of an egalitarian society, both within the Black community and between Blacks and whites. And you see all these famous quotes like this one here, and even as she sort of focused on the family and this connection between being a mother and a wife, people accused her of having relationships with her foster children, these sort of horrific things, to try to talk down who she was as an individual. And really, she was devoted to thinking about sort of the quest for Black solidarity and this rights for Black women, through understanding her own identity as a mother and a wife, and the constructs of what all of those things mean. And she lived until she was 105, so she continued to do great work up into her death as well. Now, Audre Lorde very much takes on the same conversations of Anna Julia Cooper, according to LeBron, but looking at many more types of identity for Black women. So that she's Black, a woman, lesbian, poet, activist, and mother, as well as connecting it up to her sexuality as well. She writes this poem, as cited in LeBron's work, called "Who Said It Was Simple," about breaking down the racial and sexual issues of her entire identity as a whole. Lorde wants us to understand that these white women are ethically caught between white men's patriarchy and the system of white power, on which they in fact have come to depend on for the quality of their lives. So many more identity politics than just race and gender that Cooper looked at. As she states in her work, right, she needs all of these pieces of her identities to survive, right? They're all important to who she is as a Black woman. She is a Black lesbian, feminist, socialist, poet, mother of two, and partner in an interracial domestic arrangement. This would cause a person to choose a less controversial identity. However, Lorde stated, "I simply do not believe that one aspect of myself can possibly profit from the oppression of any other part of my identity." And she saw this in education, right? They said that it was not their place for women to be educated. And that they often found themselves in scenarios that they didn't expect, right? So not only was she the only Black girl at her school, but people thought that she was unintelligent because she couldn't see. She had bad eyesight and she couldn't see the board. And even to the place that her family was blamed for a suicide in their building. Indeed, so problematic were blacks who insisted on occupying places where they normally did not belong, that when the landlord of the building Lord's family lived in committed suicide, her family was signaled out as the cause, since it was presumed the landlord had hit such hard times that he had been forced to rent to blacks out of necessity, which is a really scary thing to hear. And all of this also comes down to her understanding of her own personal sexuality and erotic power, binding to fulfillment and appreciation, and resisting oppression. And so these two ideas of the problem of sexism and sexual violence perpetuated by men, white and black, despite our popular images of sexual liberation in the 60s among the Woodstock generation, philosophical engagement with sex or pornography were not prevalent as they are today. And so she talks about sadomasochism in that this idea, while she doesn't denounce it as sort of a fetish necessarily, she sees it as sort of a problem in the way that it thinks about domination, right? Sadomasochism is an institutionalized celebration of dominant-subordinate relationships, and it prepares us either to accept subordination to enforce dominance, even in play to affirm the exertion of power over powerlessness, is erotic, is empowering, is to set the emotional and social stage for the continuation of that relationship, politically, socially, and economically. That in many ideas of sadomasochism, you can think about the way that people utilize this in sort of their day-to-day life, that they're thinking about dominant versus subordinate people. And they have to sort of move beyond these problems, right, to understand each other's own identities and to see them as equal. I like that LeBron kind of thinks about what these women would say about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, as neither of them are alive anymore. I had to double check to make sure Audre Lorde wasn't alive anymore. She did die in 92, unfortunately. But I like that he kind of addresses this in that what these women would have said about All Lives versus Black Lives Matter. So you can read these here. Maybe I should fix this. And then for Audre Lorde as well. He also said that Lorde would talk about white masculinity as the barometer for normalcy and democratic acceptance. And also how dozens of transgender Black Americans were killed under questionable circumstances in 2015, of which none got national attention. So, what is Black Lives Matter doing today, right? The movement is trying to do more than correct a deep history over the course of which Blacks generally have been oppressed. The movement is also trying to morally and practically redirect a present-day social regime in which Blackness is not only oppressed as a category, but is also to obscure a myriad of disadvantages.